Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be with you today. My name is Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas, and I'm the Director of Research at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute, or LPPI. At LPPI, we conduct research to inform policies that expand opportunity and improve outcomes for Latino communities across California and the nation. Today's webinar draws on our State of Latinos in California 2026 report. Throughout this project, we take a very comprehensive look at the conditions shaping Latino lives across the state, from education to housing to economic mobility. And we highlight both the progress that we've made and also the persistent gaps that remain. Today's conversation focuses on a critical issue that surfaced in the data and that many of you have contacted us about since the release of the report. So while Latino Californians are making real gains in higher education, those gains many times are not consistently translating into equitable access to high quality jobs and strong wages. So today we are exploring why that is, and importantly, what we can do about it. So let me briefly walk us through today's program. We will begin with opening remarks from Assembly Member Liz Ortega. We'll then hear a short presentation of key findings from our report by my colleague Mariah Bonilla, who's one of the lead authors in this work. And after that, we'll move into the panel discussion with an outstanding group of leaders and experts who will leave ample time to hear from you and answer your questions at the very end. On that note, we'd love to hear from you all and make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen throughout the whole webinar. We encourage you to share your questions as they come up. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, Assemblymember Liz Ortega. Assemblymember Ortega has been one of the strongest leaders in the legislature working on the very issues we'll be discussing today. And she has been a close partner of LPPI's work, including participating in our 2025 policy briefing on automation and the Latino workforce. A longtime labor and community leader, she has spent more than 20 years advocating for working families and safe, healthy communities across California. As chair of the Assembly Labor and Employment Committee, she represents and amplifies the voices of more than 19 million workers statewide. And as vice chair of the California Latino Legislative Caucus, she continues to champion civil rights and economic opportunity. Assemblymember Ortega, thank you so much for being with us today. We're honored to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really, an honor to be here with you all today, especially in this moment in time, as we talk about what's happening with our Latino community and what we're seeing at the federal level. It's even more important than ever to have conversations like these to talk about pathways to opportunity. And for me, that means something really personal, especially since I grew up in Oakland, in one of the most underserved areas with very limited resources and even more limited opportunities. It was organizations like yourselves and the research that you do that helped many like me and others get to Sacramento and have a voice in these very important discussions. Your LPPI report asks us to sit with a very important question, which is what happens when you climb the ladder? When you do everything right, when you get an education, when you work hard, and you do everything that you were supposed to do, and then you have someone like Trump who comes into office, and all the work and all the research dismantles many of that. I've been asking myself that question for the last 3 years since entering into the assembly. And I answer it by saying we have to do more. We have to work harder and we have to uplift our voices even louder. And that means making sure that we take reports like yours and, you know, use it to create policy that's actually going to make a difference, and then ensuring that we put the resources behind it. One of the things that we've been working as a caucus, especially in the Latino caucus, is making sure that we uplift policies that will help uplift the work that you're doing and your research. And that included Senator Reyes's bill SB 294, the Workplace Know Your Rights Act, to keep workplace safe for immigrant workers. As a leader, I've championed work on keeping workers safe, and I'm fighting wage theft. That is another thing that I've been really focused on, and using some of the research and making sure that we uplift those in our Latino community who have been victims of wage theft, and making sure that we uplift that as a policy priority, just like we did when we were talking about other kinds of thefts in the state. And so I continue to look forward to working with all of you, making sure that we put all of your research, your policy into something that doesn't just sit on a shelf, but actually we put into practice. Because as we know, California grows and evolves, and our Latino community is not on the sidelines. We are what makes this economy the fourth largest economy in the state, and we are the light for the rest of the country. So we must continue to partner, we must continue to work together, and we must continue to fight to ensure that all of us are uplifted and be the voices that this nation needs in this moment. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future.
Thank you so much, Member Ortega, for really grounding this conversation and emphasizing the importance of turning research to action. And hello, everybody. My name is Mariah Bonilla, and I am a project policy analyst with UCLA LPPI, and I am a co-author of our State of Latinos in California 2026 report. Before I go into specific findings about education, work, and wages, I wanted to paint a fuller picture of Latinos in California. You can also access our full report on our website. California's long-term prosperity is directly tied to the well-being of Latino communities. The Latino population in California grew rapidly over the past 3 decades, and today, Latinos make up about 40% of the state. That share is projected to remain steady through 2070, and Latino communities are significantly younger than non-Latinos. And still, while Latino communities are so fundamental to the state, they also face incredible challenges. As the data I will present shows, gaps in educational attainment, industry distribution, and wage gaps all make it harder for Latino families to get ahead. As I mentioned, California's Latino population has been growing steadily, and we see a similar pattern among workers. In the last 2 decades, the size of the Latino workforce has nearly doubled from 4 million to almost 8 million workers today, and Latinos now make up 39% of the state's workforce. We also see that both Latina women and Latino men have a high labor force participation rate, and that's higher than those of their non-Latino counterparts. Yet, despite their role in the state's workforce, Latino workers, especially Latinas, face wage inequities and barriers to high-paying jobs. Latinas, for example, earn $11 an hour less than non-Latino women, while Latino men earn $15 an hour less than non-Latino men. And this is explained in part by where Latinos work. We know that Latinos tend to be concentrated in lower wage and labor-intensive industries. Latino men, for example, are more likely than non-Latino men to work in construction and agriculture. These are two industries with high injury rates and unstable earnings. And meanwhile, Latinas are more concentrated than non-Latino women in lower wage service sectors such as hospitality and retail. But to better understand wage disparities and barriers to stable, high-paying jobs, we must examine educational attainment. We have seen real improvements in educational attainment, as a larger share of young Latinos hold bachelor's degrees than older Latinos, and this is led especially by Latinas who are obtaining college degrees at higher rates than Latino men. But the gaps still remain. 18% of Latinas and 14% of Latinos hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and for non-Latinos and non-Latinas, that share is 47%. Greater access to higher education has opened new doors for some Latinos, but as we will see next, inequities still remain. Obtaining a bachelor's degree or higher does increase hourly wages for Latina and Latino workers on average. College-educated Latino men earn $16 more an hour than all Latino men, and college-educated Latinas earn $13 over the median for Latinas overall. But we find that Latinas with a college degree are earning less on average than Latino men with the same credentials. And although college-educated Latinos have higher hourly wages than all Latinos on average, wage disparities persist among college-educated workers. Even when Latinos pursue higher education and enter professional fields, the wage gap still follows them. Among college graduates, Latinas earn $10 less an hour than non-Latino women, and Latino men earn $16 less than non-Latino men. And as I previously mentioned, these wage disparities are shaped by the industries that college-educated Latinos can access. Access to higher education opens doors for Latinos to enter higher paying industries like professional, scientific, finance, and informational industries. But disparities between Latinos and non-Latinos remain. Latinos with college degrees are employed at lower rates than non-Latinos with the same credentials in higher paying industries. And as the data shows us, Latinos are earning more degrees than previous generations. They're participating in the workforce at higher rates, and still gaps persist. And the question this leaves us is why education alone is not enough, and how can we fill those gaps? And to guide through this conversation, I will pass it over to Rodrigo.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Ortega, for those powerful opening remarks. And thank you, Mariah, for walking us through these important findings. So now let's move into our panel discussion. We are really fortunate to be joined today by an incredible group of panelists who bring perspectives from higher education, workforce research, and policy advocacy. So first, we have Dr. Elizabeth Gonzalez, who's director of the Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives at UCLA. Second, we have Jesse Hernandez Reyes, director of policy and advocacy at the Campaign for College Opportunity. And last but not least, Lucero Herrera, senior research analyst at the UCLA Labor Center. Thank you for being here and for sharing your expertise with us today in this panel. So I'd like to start us off with a question about expanding access to higher education. Jesse and Dr. Gonzalez, you both have led efforts to expand access and advance equity in higher education. Based on your experience, what strategies have been most effective in expanding access beyond traditional four-year pathways, especially when it comes to community college access, transfer, and reentry? Who'd like to start, Jesse? All right, Doctora.
Yeah, I'm happy to step in. And I know Jesse was going to speak to some things that I wanted to follow up on. But first off, want to thank LPPI for hosting this important discussion because it's one of the things that we rarely talk about is what happens with once that degree is earned. We're in the middle of graduation season. And even for students who are not graduating yet, they're maybe 1 or 2 years out, and they're already thinking, what am I going to be doing come next spring or 2 springs from now. And so it's never too late and never too early to start having that conversation about careers. When it comes to the question about access, I mean, some of the, I think, most monumental policies that have opened the gates for opportunity. And the most recent one is the decision to remove SATs as a factor in college admissions, both in California and at the CSU level and then at the UC system. And I bring this up because it was a long fight to have the legislature recognize that SAT scores were a reflection of zip code and your parents' ability to pay tutors to prepare for SAT prep courses. It was a great factor in creating inequity in access, and it's also a requirement that recently has been open for conversation about either making SAT optional again or even required. And so I think we have to highlight that not only did it open up opportunities, but that universities have seen a high level of retention, continue to see a high level of retention for historically underrepresented students, even after the removal of SAT, which makes the point that SAT was never predictive of your ability to remain and be successful in college. And so I want to highlight that as an important policy because it's under threat, right? And I think we all need to be highlighting the data and the research that highlights why we don't need such SAT scores. And then your question about access and retention, I just want to say one thing about retention, that oftentimes retention metrics are a reflection of an institution's capacity and infrastructure to serve students, and less about the student's ability to graduate and be successful. And so one of the things that I know some institutions really look at, and some of my colleagues today will discuss, is what is the institution's capacity to serve and advise students, both in academic advising and career advising. So looking at things like what is our advisor to student ratio, what is our faculty to student ratio. I mean, those are all these institutional metrics of our ability to serve students in these areas. And so I just want to highlight those things and give Jessie an opportunity. I don't know if she's back yet to add to this.
Thank you so much, Doctora, for all of those insights. Our colleague Jessie is having some technical issues with her camera, but we can continue the conversation, and of course, we'll bring her back. Doctora Gonzalez, you've been leading a lot of efforts to not only expand access, but also design strategies to improve completion of degrees and the support systems that are there for students at UCLA. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as to what are some things that have worked really well in helping Latino students persist and complete their degrees?
Yes. And Jessie, I know you're logging on. If you feel ready, happy to turn it to you.
Can you all?
Yes, we see you and hear you well, Jessie. Thanks for joining.
Apologies. We did, all technically run into what's happening. But happy to help answer the first question around what strategies have been effective in expanding college access and success for Latino students. And so generally, I would say one of the most effective strategies can you all hear me? Okay? Sorry, Zoom is doing some very weird things. But to answer the question in terms of strategies that have allowed for increased college access success for Latino students has been the expansion of transfer pathways for Latino students from our community colleges to our four-year institutions. And so specifically, I want to talk about two transfer pathways. The first is the associate degree for transfer, and the second is equitable college course placement or equitable placement. So for the first pathway, for folks that are unfamiliar, the associate degree for transfer is a degree that is conferred to our California community college students as long as they can complete 60 semester or 90 quarter units that are composed of general education requirements as well as courses in a specific academic major. And so once students are able to meet those units, they're able to have a junior standing once they transfer to a CSU or a California State institution. And so from there, they have their ability to complete a bachelor's degree in 2 years as long as they're able to transfer. Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me okay?
I think we hear you well now.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Okay. Sorry, it's a little distracting with the echo. In terms of the associate degree for transfer, this was made possible in 2010 thanks to the passage of Senate Bill 1440 by then California Senator Alex Padilla. And we followed up that piece of legislation with AB 928 in 2021 to help more faithfully implement the associate degree for transfer. And the Campaign for College Opportunity has been a strong champion of the associate degree for transfer in creating these transfer pathways for more Californians and specifically more Latino students. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the data in terms of how Latino students are taking advantage of this transfer pathway. So for the 2023-24 academic year, when we look at the data, then Latino students were more likely to earn a associate's degree for transfer and be on that transfer pathway overall.
Yeah, apologies, Josie. Our audience members are letting us know that there's a strong echo. I think it's coming from your audio. So for a minute, let's continue the conversation. And then thank you so much for those insights. So again, like recapping some of what Jesse was saying, it is about expanding the pathways for people to access higher education in different ways. And a lot of progress has been made through different bills. Let's continue a little bit about the conversation and bringing back to you, Doctora Gonzalez, to think about that retention and completion, strategies and what are some things that have worked well.
Yeah, and following up on Jesse's comment about the ADT, because I had the privilege and honor of working at San Jose City College and at San Diego City College at a time when guided pathways and also AB 705, the college level placement in math and English. I mean, two pieces of legislation that really, really supported students and moved us away from remediating, right? This focus on remediation remediates. And so when we have high expectations for students, they're going to rise to the occasion. And so I think guided pathways is an exceptional example of ways to make retention and not just academic success, but also career pathways central to an institution's mission and their definition of student success. So when you look at guided pathways, it's how do we create entry pathways from just the beginning, but as they move along towards graduation and career, as simple as can be, and in disciplines that are guided by the workforce development, career placement. And so it's a great guided pathways is a great example of the merging of both the academic pathways with the career pathways. And so kind of want to highlight that in conjunction with what Jesse was talking about in community college. And I just will give a shout out to UCLA Center for Community College Partnership, Dr. Claudia Salcedo, and former director Alfred Herrera, because that program has become a national model. And we like to highlight that our transfer students have the highest retention rate on our campus. I'm going to just say it. There's this stigma, this perceived stigma about transfer student. It still is the case. But at UCLA, our transfer students are exceptional. They graduate in a timely manner. They do exceptionally well. So, Jesse, I don't know if you want to add to that, but wanted to kind of parallel that conversation.
Yeah, I think my audio issues have been fixed. Are we good? Perfect. Okay. Apologies, folks. But I definitely want to build on that, Dr. Gonzalez. I wanted to speak about, I was talking a little bit earlier around transfer pathways and the associate degree for transfer ADT being part of those successful transfer pathways for students. I wanted to go back on that point. When we look at the data, we see that, for example, in 2023-24 academic year, Latino students were more likely than their peers to be on that transfer pathway via the ADT and also complete. So when we looked at all ADT completers for that academic year, 50% of them were Latino students, which is pretty remarkable. And then when we looked at other student groups, for example, white students, they were only at 44%, right? So we're seeing Latino students take advantage of these transfer pathways via the ADT. I also want to make sure to note that our Latino students are taking advantage of other transfer pathways through things like equitable placement. And so when I talk about equitable placement, I'm talking about how our community college students are placed in their college journeys in terms of their courses. So up until 2017, oftentimes our students were not placed in the courses that were most adequate for them to maximize their time to completion and to maximize the possibility of them transferring to a four-year institution. So with the passage of AB 705 or Assembly Bill 705 by Assemblymember Irwin, that was again championed by the Campaign for College Opportunity, we made it possible so that our California community college students could start at transfer level courses that were adequate for their preparation and to maximize again time to completion, etc., so that students would not be placed in below transfer level math courses or remedial courses, as we often call them, that cover high school level coursework, but that don't provide those transfer credits for students. And so we've seen a pretty remarkable impact in the passage of equitable course placement as we see the data on not only enrollment in transfer level courses, but completion by Latino students. So just sharing a little bit about that, when we look at prior to the passage of AB 705 or equitable course placement, only 21% of Latino students, for example, were enrolled directly in transfer level math courses at our California community colleges. After the implementation of this piece of legislation, we saw 80% of Latino students, at least in 2021-22, being enrolled in these transfer level math courses. And we even saw gains in completion of these transfer level math courses within 1 year of enrollment for students. So prior again to the implementation of AB 705, we saw only 19% of Latino students completing a transfer level math course within 1 year of enrollment. And after the passage of this piece of legislation, we saw that rise to 46%. And we've seen very similar gains on the transfer level English side, where we've seen not only more Latino students enrolling in these transfer level English courses, but completing at much higher rates. So for example, after the implementation of this piece of legislation, we saw the number rise from 44 to 60% of Latino students completing a transfer level English course within 1 year of enrollment. So again, as long as these our Latino students have these very structured, intentional transfer level pathways, and they're publicized well to students, and supports are provided to colleges and our faculty and our staff to implement these transfer pathways, we're seeing Latino students take advantage of them to again get towards this larger goal of Latino college attainment and completion.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Dr. Gonzalez. So today's conversation, as many people are asking in the Q&A, is actually about the whole path from expanding access to higher ed and expanding success rates and completion. And now let me turn to you, Lucero, because that next step, right, which is what Dr. Gonzalez was mentioning, people are graduating during these days. What does that next step look like for our students to be able to have access to those career paths that are equitable, that provide access to economic opportunity and mobility?
Yes, good morning, and thank you so much, Rodrigo, and the team for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. Also, thank you, LPPI, for this great research and for providing such critical data on these issues. I think the comments from Dr. Gonzalez and from Jesse really underscore how interconnected the systems of work and education are, especially for our Latino communities. I am speaking from my work at the UCLA Labor Center. We conduct community engaged research with workers, especially in low-wage sectors here in California. And we do this work grounded in our partnerships with unions and worker centers and public agencies. One of our key areas of research has been young workers, and we've been taking a deeper dive into workers and learners. These are young people that are balancing work and school at the same time. And I think this intersection of school and work is really important because it helps us nuance this conversation, right? And kind of like what you're mentioning, Rodrigo. And it helps us question whether the institutions that are holding kind of like this pipeline together are really creating the conditions in which students and workers are able to access meaningful opportunities, are able to build their skills, their expertise, their experience, and are able to transition and then grow into stable quality jobs. So one of the most important research findings is that most students are already workers, right? In California, 1 in 2 young workers ages 16 to 24 are enrolling in school. That means that many students are not only balancing classes, they're also working in restaurants, they're working the late shifts in retail, they're doing gig work, they're doing care work, they're supporting their families and themselves, often out of economic necessity, right? Because tuition is increasing, the cost of living continues to increase. So to be able to make all this work, many students are working intensive hours, right? So they're working often 20 plus hours per week, which research shows can have a negative effect on their academic performance. And not only that, like for us, the type of jobs that these young people hold are really important to look at, right? Because this early employment experiences really shape later career outcomes, earnings, career trajectories. So what we find is that most of the jobs are really concentrated in the service sector. These are jobs that are often low wage, that have limited benefits. There are jobs with high rates of wage theft, which Assemblymember Liz Ortega was mentioning at the top of the call, right? So this happens when workers are not paid minimum wage, when they're not paid overtime, when they're not offered meal and rest breaks, when they have deductions from their check that are unlawful, when they're not paid for or reimbursed for kind of like workplace related expenses, among other common violations. These are also jobs that have schedule instability. And in some cases, there are workplaces that have very serious health and safety concerns. And then also important to mention is that all of these jobs are not really connected, right, with the chosen career path that many students have. So a student may be building or pursuing a career in healthcare or education, but then they're holding a retail job that, while it's providing income in the short term, is providing very little in terms of the career building that we all know that is needed, right? In terms of mentorship, in terms of professional development, or opportunities for mobility. And then the other thing that happens when all of these things are intersecting is that the young people that are working and are balancing school at the same time have very demanding schedules that makes it very difficult for them to access the opportunities that Jesse and Dr. Gonzalez were discussing, right? Like they have less time to go to counseling, they have less time to attend the working events on campus, to really take advantage of the career building opportunities. And when the only internships that are available are unpaid, that also presents a real equity issue, right? Because it assumes that students have the capacity to work for free. And for many working students, we know that's not the case. So all this to say that institutions really need to adapt to the reality that most students are working and are working increasingly more, right? So they need to adapt and make sure that are offering the accommodations needed to support working students. This includes, strengthening worker education early on so that workers can learn about their rights and can understand how to navigate labor markets. It also means creating institutional cultures that support working students. So in higher ed, it means having offerings in asynchronous learning, for example, or flexible scheduling, being able to expand advising and career services that are outside of traditional hours. And it also means better preparation for faculty and staff to support students with complex family and work responsibilities. And then employers also have a big role to play, right? They're the ones creating the jobs. So they can create jobs that pay, living wages, that offer benefits, that offer stable schedules, that are really in compliance with labor laws, and that are promoting, worker voice so that workers have a say on the conditions of their job. And at the same time, and I think both Dr. Gonzalez and Jesse touch on this, is that we need to build kind of like that stronger bridge between education and employment through paid internships, apprenticeships, and other work-based learning opportunities that can really expand and strengthen our workforce development system. Here in California and in Los Angeles County, one encouraging development has been the adoption and the expansion of the High Road Training Partnership model. So what's promising about it is that it's workforce that brings together training providers and unions and employers and community organizations and other stakeholders to really connect workers to, training pathways and good jobs while improving labor standards within these industries. So this recognizes that it's not just about placement, it's about connecting workers to good jobs with long-term mobility and protections. And finally, and I know I've been kind of like emphasizing this point quite a bit, is the issue of job quality, right? Like, yes, we want jobs that pay higher wages, and wages matter, absolutely. But so do the broader conditions that support dignity, stability, and worker voice, right? And, we have to think, if the jobs that continue to create the most jobs are low wage and unstable, then educational gains alone are not enough to address the inequality and the lack of economic mobility for Latinos.
Thank you so much for that, Lucero. And thank you, to three of you to be able to connect that thread, right? About systems from before college to within college to after, the whole like labor system, systems that Lucero was mentioning. And thanks, Lucero, for the research that you do at the Labor Center. So we are getting close to the time when we want to open it to our audience members to ask more questions. So I encourage our audience members to continue asking questions in the Q&A. We're going to get to it in a moment. But before we do that, I do want to ask the three of you, if you could prioritize, from your point of view, from the things that you lead the most, if you could prioritize one or two policy or institutional changes that would most improve economic returns to education for Latino communities, what would they be and why? Let's start with you, Jesse.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Doubling down on one of the points that Lucero had mentioned, I think one of the most effective policy or institutional changes that we could pursue is embedding mandatory career advising or career pathways guidance for students early on in their undergraduate journey, whether they're starting at a California community college or a four-year institution. Some of the data that I can, drop in the chat afterwards shows us that students are receiving, when they do even receive any type of career advising or career pathways guidance, they're receiving it way too late after their first year. And we know that the data shows us that the first year of a college student's journey is crucial to retention, to their academic motivation, and helps shape the rest of their academic trajectory. So if we could do one thing, I would recommend for us to embed that mandatory guidance so that not only our students are being motivated to complete a college degree, but that's actually translating to economic mobility in terms of high quality, high paying careers for themselves and their families, because we know that for a lot of Latino students who are first gen, right, first in their families to go to college, that college degree is not just for them, but for their families. And so we need that to be a better outcome for our students and bridge that breakdown that we're seeing between higher education completion and career transition by providing that early and culturally relevant and culturally sensitive career advising or career pathway guidance for our students.
Thank you, Jesse. Lucero, what do you think from your perspective?
Yes, I mean, I am biased towards labor, right? So like my solutions are based in workplace, solutions and recommendations that really go into strengthening worker voice. So in that vein, I will say that we will need to strengthen workers' ability to participate in shaping the conditions of their jobs, right? A key part of that is building worker power, collective power, because that's actually what translates into higher wages, mobility, and stability. Strengthening labor standards, supporting organizing, and expanding mechanisms for worker, to have the voice to be able to affect change in their workplaces. And we're already seeing a lot of momentum in that area, right? We see a lot of like organizing in the last few years and union organizing, especially in places like Amazon or Starbucks, or even here, in the UC system with the graduate student researchers and workers. And what I want to mention is that this is really led by young workers and especially Latino workers, right? So we see a lot of encouraging developments there. And then the second thing is, it's a key opportunity to grow labor education. And Assemblymember Liz Ortega touched on this, but California is really leading the way through legislation that is aimed to support workers, right? And one key piece of legislation is AB 800, which is the Workplace Readiness Week. And the goal is really to ensure that young people in high school or even earlier, right? We're talking about the K through 12 system, really have access to education and how to understand their rights as workers, to be able to navigate the workplaces, to learn about basic protections around wages, scheduling, and workplace safety. And I think for young Latino students in particular, who are disproportionately represented in this early low wage kind of like jobs, this kind of labor education is really a powerful equity intervention to be able to advocate for themselves, to be able to really translate that education into economic mobility and their ability to do better.
Thank you so much, Lucero. That's a really important perspective from the labor perspective. Now we're going back to you, Dr. Gonzalez. If you were to prioritize one or two policy or institutional changes to improve systems, which ones would you prioritize?
Yes, and I know I'll speak to the education or educational institution side, but I do want to echo what Lucero has highlighted, which is the collective power of workers organizing. I mean, and also voting, right? I think those are critical avenues that our community needs to be engaged in. I'm going to add to what Jesse really highlighted, which was the need to make career advising a key metric for institutions. But not just in the advising area, I think that also in the academic component. So, and I'm going to speak, I think, for the UC first, and then a little bit about the community college and what I think they're doing great, is that at least for the UC system, a third of students are now first generation. And so the goal of the degree is in addition to learning and lifelong learning and theorizing and doing research, it's also practical, right? And so I think that the institutions that were created for education as a leisurely, academic endeavor needs to really start shifting its lens to workforce readiness. And I think that that's something that it will require institutional culture shift, in particular for systems like the UC. I think CSUs are doing a much better job. And I think the California Community College obviously is leading the way in that sense, is that they are looking at workforce development. It's central to their function. And so, one piece of recent development there that I'm really glad is happening is the baccalaureate program at the community college level, because it's an example of meeting workforce development demands with what the community college is preparing students to do, right? And so I think that the UC system would benefit from thinking, how do we embed career discussions into every classroom, right? When I was an undergrad, it was not until the spring of my third year that a faculty took time from one lecture to talk to us about careers in psychology, or graduate pathways in psychology. And it was literally the last class. And two, he said, if you want to stay and listen, stay. If not, you can go. It was optional. And I think that while he was innovating by making it part of his lecture, it shouldn't have been optional, and it shouldn't have been my third year as an undergrad, right? So I think embedding it as a key metric, things like what % of students are getting paid internships, how many are landing a good job 6 months after. And I'll just finish with UCLA and the Alumni Association. So at UCLA, the Career Center can support students during their time as students and 6 months after. And this is the function of the Career Center. After 6 months, they're no longer able to access career services from the Career Center. And so now the UCLA Alumni Association has developed a framework that allows them to support our alumni in career development through their lifespan, right? And so I think those are some innovative ways that institutions can really start taking that as a key metric.
Thank you so much for the three of you for those incredible insights. And now I've been tracking the Q&A from the audience, and there are a few questions about financing higher education. How do students pay for it, and how to navigate that? So let's start with a question about how does debt when going to higher education impact Latino students differently potentially than others? And what are some solutions so that Latino students can more easily finance their path throughout higher ed?
Rodrigo, I could start if you'd like answering that question. Great. So from the data, contrary to sometimes what we believe, Latino students do take on a debt when they enter higher education. Obviously, they try to keep it at a minimum. We see a lot of students, they opt to enter a higher education institution that's closer to home to try to keep costs down, as opposed to, being out of state or a bit farther from home, taking into account the cost, the total cost of tuition, total cost of attendance. And so we do see Latino students struggle with debt. Although, when we compare it to other student groups, we do see that they take on a bit lower level of debt compared to some other groups, for example, like our Black student counterparts. Regardless, debt is an important factor in college access and success for Latino students. And in California, We've been very mindful of trying to expand college affordability options for our Latino students, whether that is through state financial aid or increasing information to our students about federal financial aid that may be available to them through the FAFSA. And so what we see in California is we're trying to increase access to state financial aid opportunities through the Cal Grant. The Cal Grant takes into account not only tuition, but total cost of attendance. There's other opportunities that we see Latino students take advantage of outside of the Cal Grant, for example, the middle class scholarship. We saw a modernization of the middle class scholarship a couple of years ago in 2021 to be exact, to try to expand and provide a little bit more financial aid to our lower income students that need that financial aid to be able to support their college journey. So that's what we're seeing at large. I would also be, remiss if I didn't underscore the role of our undocumented students when we're talking about our Latino college student population. We know that undocumented students are not eligible for federal financial aid and only state financial aid in California. And so, unfortunately, what we've been seeing over the last almost decade is a decline in are undocumented students applying to state financial aid that is available to them. And this is for a myriad of reasons. Obviously, the political climate that we're in, we see continued misinformation about what financial aid opportunities are available to undocumented students. We're seeing the challenges to in-state tuition, state financial aid, to DACA overall. And so our students are a bit fearful in sharing their personal information to our state entities, even though that is protected under state law. And so we need to address affordability, not only at large for our Latino student population, but also be very intentional in doing that for our undocumented Latino students.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And I do want to get to ask a few, question to each of you. Going on to what you just said, Jesse, about some changes in the political climate, some changes from the federal government, these for Lee's. How do you think the new federal student loan changes would discourage first generation or Latino students from pursuing some advanced degrees like into the healthcare pathway? Doctora Gonzalez, what do you think?
Yeah, when you ask that question, what comes to mind is the federal government's recent definition of the changing definition of what constitutes a professional degree, right? That no longer includes things like nursing. I think it's a broad list, and I'm having a hard time recalling all of them. Do you know, Rodrigo?
Yeah, it's also impacting access to law school, for instance, and there's another set of degrees that are no longer listed in that.
Right. Things like nursing, public health. I mean, when you are no longer considering these as professional degrees, and these are areas where our Latino community is much needed and it's underrepresented, and you're basically closing off that pathway by not defining it as a professional degree, and thus not being eligible for these loans, right? And so I think that's a huge blow. But in my recent conversations with students, I think we think about debt in terms of like fiscal and economic debt, but our students are also thinking about time, right? They and especially our transfer students, I think they have a long journey towards their degree, and oftentimes they have to juggle with, do I pursue a graduate degree that's going to take more time? Do I go straight to the workforce, even though it might be a lower entry job? And so I think we also need to expand our view on debt, that it includes time and years, which is why I think the credit for lifelong for credit for prior learning at the community college is an important legislative or policy change, because it gives students credit for that learning that they've done in the workplace. And so just wanted to add that to the conversation on debt.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez. And besides the changes in those definitions, there's been also changes in like limits on student borrowing that could make either law school or medical school less accessible for Latinos and others. I encourage and we will share a report that LPPI just released on the impact for law students, for instance. Really quick, Lucero, we do have a question for you, and this is talking about that wage gap and how to close those wage gaps from a labor perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue that needs kind of like a multi-levels solution, right? It's not just a policy level, but it's also changing kind of like the cultures at the institutions and employers in workplaces and industries, right? But I think California has been a leader in passing stronger worker protections. And just this year, a slate of new legislation went into effect that is really seeking to address some of this, right? So, for example, we have legislation that is really expanding equal pay protections to cover the full range of compensation, right? So this includes bonuses and stock options that for those other kind of like higher paid jobs is really important because it kind of like invisibilizes some of the wage differentials that can be among college-educated Latinos and the non-Latino white counterparts. Also tightening salary transparency in job postings, which is especially important, right? Because when you see those job postings and you see the salaries, these are like tools that help you to be able to advocate for yourself. And for many of our Latino communities, like this kind of like social capital and this human capital and the knowledge of how to navigate, how to have these conversations about compensation or rights is often invisibilized. So having kind of like this information and democratizing that information is a step forward. Another key sort of legislation in this regard is also what Assemblymember Liz Ortega mentioned, which is the Know Your Rights legislation that went into effect, really pushing employers to be able to publish this information in the workers' language so they are able to learn more about their rights. And then lastly, on the labor enforcement side, when any of this kind of like labor violations happen, there have been an increase in resources for the enforcement agency so they can assess things like higher penalties for unpaid wage judgments. So these are kind of like all the different tools, but we still need to think about at the institutional level, at the employer level, how we can think and identify additional levers, right, that can help us move the needle a little bit towards equality and equity for Latino communities.
Thank you so much, Lucero. And unfortunately, the hour went by really, really quickly. So I want to thank again to our speakers and to everybody who joined us today. There are really some clear next steps for us to keep improving the lives of everybody in California. And as we say, Latinos are not just an important part of California's story, they are central to it and to its future. I also want to take some time to thank the Avon Foundation for the generous support in making this work possible. And thank you all again to the audience. We hope that they stay connected with all of us, with our panelists, and we will send an email after the webinar with a recording, with the slides, and with many resources from our panelists and their work. Thank you, everybody.